David Vizard here, and you are watching PowerTec 10. This is the program which does not tolerate BS, incorrect technology, and poor products. If it's good, we promote the heck out of it. So that's what you'll see on this program. A lot of top-level promotions. If you can bear with me for maybe 20 minutes, I will give you the benefit of over 60 years. That's a lifetime of building high-performance and race-winning engines. In this episode, and I believe it's 93, we are going to talk about something which is very often spoken of, but very rarely is anything done about it to educate the end user on how to achieve it. Let me ask you a question here. How many times have you read that it's torque that accelerates the vehicle? Plenty. Torque is king. It rules, not horsepower. Horsepower is a product of torque and RPM. That's a slightly different thing, but if you don't have the RPM and you don't have the torque, or both, you don't have horsepower. So what I'm going to do in this episode here is I am going to give you some of the knowledge that I don't think you could bring out of a ProStock engine builder. They may know it, but they're not about to tell you. However, I'm going to. So here we go. Let's assume you have got the mixture quality, the ignition, and the engine's friction into reasonable bounds as far as being effective is concerned. That means we are delivering the right mixture with the right kind of atomization. We're delivering a good spark that lights that charge off in an effective manner and burns it effectively, and that the friction level of your engine is normal. Right now, I'm not necessarily talking about ProStock friction levels. I'm talking about a well-built street motor. Assuming you've got those three things right, and there's no reason that you shouldn't, we'll deal with that separately, then the two things that dictate the torque are the trapped volumetric efficiency and the compression ratio. Nothing else. Just those two factors. And they're related. Now, let me explain the trapped volumetric efficiency. Normally, when we talk about volumetric efficiency, or VE as it's shortened up to, we talk about how much air goes through the engine. Well, some of that air goes out the exhaust in the overlap period. That's a case of over scavenging, and quite a few engines do that, but not until we get to the higher end of things. Normally, the overlap is such that the intake charge will come in and it will scavenge some of the exhaust, but not all of the exhaust will go out. These days, they tend not to try and over scavenge engines if it's an emission engine, because having some of the exhaust retained in the cylinder means that you kind of get an exhaust recycling effect without having to have a smog pump. Anyway, back to the point. What we have to do is to get that intake charge so that it comes out of the intake valve and stops just shy of going out the exhaust valve. And we have to continue to fill the cylinder. So we need a high trapped volumetric efficiency. Now then, the compression ratio. The more we squeeze that charge, the more energy we get from the burning fuel. More energy means higher cylinder pressures, and that means more torque. Okay, let's delve into the factors that affect the trapped volumetric efficiency. Valve event timing is the key here. What it means is we have to get the opening just right so that we maximize the valve opening for what the engine wants during the actual downward stroke of the induction stroke. Now then, the air is never going to keep up with that demand by the piston, so it needs to be held open long enough after to attempt to let the air that got kind of left behind to catch up and go into the cylinder. And then it has to close at the right time, because now the piston's coming up the bore, to trap that air in there. In other words, it's held open too long and the piston's on its way up the bore too far, it will push air back out. So we don't want that. We need to close that intake valve just at the right time so that it's about to push air out, but it doesn't. That traps the most air in the cylinder. So what we have here is a situation where we have to open the valve at the right time to have the extraction effect, the scavenging effect, take place as much as possible. It has to be opened far enough to allow the cylinder to fill on when the piston's going down the bore as well as possible, and it has to be closed late enough that the filling that didn't take place on the downward stroke, and that is any vacuum that may still exist at bottom dead center, and the ramming effect from a suitably sized port. It needs to be able to optimize that before the valve closes. So what we have here is we have to have a balance either side of the intake, actual intake stroke, in the opening and the closing. Now then, what is the best way to handle that? By paying attention to the lobe centerline angle. Not the valve opening and closing points per se, but the lobe centerline angle, because that's what governs, that and the advance is what governs how much happens before and how much happens after. Right, now here's an interesting thing, interesting piece of information. If your engine is not making the torque it should do, and I'm going to put a chart in which tells you approximately how much torque the engine should make if the cam is right for any given compression ratio. It's not an exact science because there's a lot of other factors involved, but it gives you a good guide, and the chances are your engine's not making it. And you know why? You didn't take notice of my lobe centerline angle deal, right? You put the wrong lobe centerline angle. Too wide a lobe centerline angle is a surefire way to destroy torque. Do you want me to say that again? No, I don't think so. You should have got that by now. Anyway, what we have here is our first rule of thumb is to get the cam events or the valve opening events right for the compression ratio we have. That's got to combine the two there. If we do that, we maximize the trapped volumetric efficiency. Now, we're talking about torque here, right? We're not talking about torque at any specific RPM. We're talking about it pretty much throughout the RPM. Now remember I said that power is a product of RPM and torque. Notice I didn't say horsepower. Power. Power in foot-pounds of work done per minute or per second is RPM times torque. It becomes horsepower when we divide it by 33,000 or 550, depending whether we're talking about per minute or per second. But let's not complicate the issue here. Something I think I should slip in here, and I think I've more than hinted about it in other of the PowerTec 10 videos. If you build a stroker motor and you had your cam right before you put the stroke into it, it's not right now. When you go up in cubic inches on a stroker motor, you need to tighten up the lobe centerline angle so that you get the full effect of the added cubic inches. If you don't, your torque per cube goes down and you only get about half the benefit of those extra cubes. So the rule of thumb here is stroker motor or a big bore motor, or any time you increase the displacement, needs a tighter lobe centerline angle than you had on the cam before. Assuming the cam before was right, that is. Now it probably wasn't. It probably was on too wide a lobe centerline angle, which is so common in the industry. So the cam you want for your stroker motor may need to be on quite a lot tighter lobe centerline angle. You'll hear people say, yes, but I want to retain the idle. If you want to retain the idle, don't use as much duration. What's the point in giving away torque just to get the idle? No, that's not the way to do it. Trust me. The lobe centerline angle, and I've said this before many times, is not, repeat, not an adjustable feature. You get your idle by making the overlap to a value that suits your engine to get the idle you want. In other words, if you want the engine to idle, don't use so much overlap. Same goes for engines that are for marine deals. It isn't the lobe centerline angle that you have to watch. Too much overlap and you could be sucking water up the exhaust pipe. Anyway, back to our subject. I think that I can round up what I'm going to say explicitly on valve events here. What I want to move on to now is going to be how the compression ratio affects the situation, both in terms of the camshaft valve events and the dynamic compression. So let's move on to that. Before we can actually select a cam, the compression ratio has to come under serious consideration. This is a factor which is vastly underestimated by your typical enthusiast engine builder. Now, what we have to consider here is the fact that the actual compression ratio that exists at low RPM is dictated by the point that the intake valve closes. The normal compression ratio is calculated assuming the intake valve closes at bottom dead center. Well, it never does. In fact, what we find is that with big cams, the piston can be almost a third of the way up the bore before the intake valve closes. This has to be allowed for. If we don't have sufficient cylinder pressure, then our combustion forces are going to be lower, even if the volumetric efficiency is higher. But it won't be as high as it could be if we make an allowance by calculating the dynamic compression. That's the compression ratio which actually exists at the point of valve closure. Now you may say, how to calculate that? Before I tell you what we need, let me tell you that Stan Weiss has a program which calculates the dynamic compression ratio. So I'm going to put his contact details across the bottom here. Email him and say you want the program that calculates the dynamic compression. And for what it's worth, this program also does the calculations for a whole load of other stuff. Now, I'm not going to do a review on the program. That's not what this is all about here. What I will say is you will, if you're a serious engine builder, you will find it very useful. That said, let's move on. If we put in a big cam, whatever we may gain in volumetric efficiency, we lose because the effective compression ratio has dropped. And we lose big time, especially at low RPM. The worst mistake you can make is putting in a cam that's too big for the compression involved. Let's define what we actually need here. If you're running, say, a truck engine that's going to do heavy towing and it's going to be a wide open throttle or near it for long periods of time, your dynamic compression needs to be about 7.5. Your static compression for that could well be around 9:1. Now, what happens here is you'll get the best torque for the fuel octane concerned and make an allowance for the fact that the cylinder heads are going to get mighty hot, which could otherwise induce detonation. Now, if you're doing a street vehicle that is a true street driver and it's not under high load for a long period of time, and you've got good control of the engine temperature, then an 8:1 compression ratio works fine on decent 87 octane fuel. This will result in cylinder pressures of around about 200 psi. That's where they need to be. If you're running a race engine, then you need at least a dynamic compression of 9:1, at least. ProStock engines run way over that. Typical ProStock engine can have as much as 280 psi cranking pressure. Your typical road racer can be around 240-ish. So those are numbers that you need to keep in mind. If you're not going to stick with these numbers I've recommended here, you can be sure your engine will lose a lot of torque and power. Also, it will come on the cam later, and the low speed torque, and low speed depends on how big the cam is and how racy the engine is, can suffer greatly. Stick with these numbers if you require torque right off idle. Here's the graph I mentioned earlier on. If you look at the scales, you can see where your torque output per cube should lie. Now remember, these numbers here are not hard and fast, and they can be influenced a great deal by other factors. But for a typical single 4-barrel or tunnel ram type manifold, they'll work pretty well. The lower end of the graph is more suited to predicting what a single 4-barrel carb would do. The upper end is more suited to predicting what a tunnel ram setup would do as per a ProStock. Notice that when we get up to about 18:1, the gains become virtually negligible. What this graph does not show is the effect that can be had with a well-packaged tuned intake port and camshaft. In such situations, the torque figures can go over these figures shown here. Before closing here, there is one last point I'd like to bring up. If the engine you are modifying has a tuned port type injection, that is a long runner going to each cylinder from a common plenum, like the Ford or the small block Chevy engines from about 1990-ish on, then there's something you need to know. It is possible This is the first point. It is possible to get very good torque figures per cube. For instance, I built a 10.5-to-1 302, which made 448 foot-pounds of torque. That is almost 1.5 foot-pounds per cube. Just fell short of that. That is something very special. But it deserves an article on its own, which will be upcoming, so stay tuned with PowerTec 10. And before signing off, let me just once more say, please subscribe, comment, have us notify when we've got the new edition of PowerTec 10 up, and most of all, like. Thank you for watching.